It's just another morning in Medford, Texas. The kitchen is bustling, the banter is light, and the morning routine hums with the chaotic familiarity of a family that assumes they have forever. George Cooper stands by the door, briefcase in hand. He looks at his wife and his children, says a casual, "See y'all later," and walks out the door. The camera doesn't linger. The music doesn't swell. It is profoundly, devastatingly normal. Minutes later, he is dead. The tragedy of George Cooper's death isn't just the suddenness of his fatal heart attack. It is the haunting realization that he slipped out of his family's life as quietly as he lived inside it. For 7 seasons of Young Sheldon, George was a man hiding in plain sight, a father and husband whose deepest struggles, sacrifices, and unfulfilled dreams were constantly overshadowed by the towering personalities around him. How does the loudest man in the room, the head of the household, end up feeling like a ghost in his own home? There is a specific kind of loneliness reserved for the person holding the roof up. If you do your job perfectly, nobody ever looks at the ceiling. When we are first introduced to George Cooper, the narrative framing sets him up as a punchline. A beer-drinking, football-obsessed, slightly dim-witted Texan who is completely out of his depth, raising a child prodigy. But, as the series peels back its layers, a deeply tragic portrait emerges. George is not a simpleton. He is an emotionally intelligent, profoundly observant man who actively chooses to absorb the friction of his household so that his family doesn't fracture. George's invisibility didn't start with the birth of a genius son. It was baked into the foundation of his marriage. From the day he married Mary, George was positioned as a disappointment. He wasn't the pious, refined man Mary's mother, Connie, envisioned for her daughter. He was the mistake Mary made in the back of a car. This dynamic is weaponized perfectly in the first season, over something as trivial as a brisket recipe. When George asks Connie for her famous recipe, she sadistically sends him on a wild goose chase for fake ingredients, resulting in a 14-hour cooking disaster. On the surface, it's a classic sitcom trope, but the comedic veneer shatters when George finally confronts both Connie and Mary. He doesn't yell about the wasted meat. He tells Connie, his voice thick with years of quiet humiliation, that he knows she never thought he was good enough for her daughter. The true heartbreak, however, isn't Connie's cruelty. It's Mary's complicity. Mary defends her mother. She dismisses George's hurt. In his own home, George is treated like an uninvited guest, whose feelings are a secondary concern. He realizes that no matter how hard he works to provide for this family, in the eyes of his wife and mother-in-law, he will forever be the inadequate boy from high school. He is invisible as a patriarch, reduced to a functional utility who pays the mortgage, but is denied the basic dignity of respect. Because George is intimately familiar with the pain of being overlooked, he develops a quiet superpower. He can spot the other invisible people in the room. In the Cooper household, that person is Missy. While Mary's universe orbits around Sheldon's intellectual needs, and Connie actively indulges George's rebellion, Missy is consistently pushed to the margins. George recognizes this because he lives in those exact same margins. This shared invisibility culminates in a beautifully poignant evening where George takes Missy on a date to Red Lobster. He doesn't just take her to dinner. He dresses up in a suit. He pulls out her chair. He engages her not as an afterthought, but as the center of his attention. During this dinner, we see a George Cooper who is rarely allowed to exist. He isn't the exhausted buffer between Mary and Sheldon. He is charming, attentive, and deeply present. He gives Missy the exact experience he is starving for, the feeling of being chosen. By treating his daughter like the most important person in the world, George is silently repairing his own inner child. He is ensuring that the cycle of emotional neglect stops with him, projecting the love he wishes to receive onto the daughter who shares his emotional exile. What makes emotional invisibility so corrosive is that it is often self-inflicted. George actively chooses to swallow his own misery to keep the fragile Cooper ecosystem from collapsing. As his marriage deteriorates, the chasm between George and Mary widens. He feels unappreciated, she feels overwhelmed. This emotional starvation makes the temptation of Brenda Sparks so potent. Brenda doesn't offer George a torrid physical affair. She offers him a space where he is enjoyed. She laughs at his jokes. She listens without immediately cataloguing his faults. It is intoxicating for a man who has been starving for warmth. Yet, in a defining moment of tragic restraint, George attempts to do the right thing. Feeling guilty for his emotional wandering, he drives to the church to surprise his wife, seeking to reconnect. Instead, he pulls up to see Mary hidden in the shadows, laughing and sharing a cigarette with youth pastor Rob. The intimacy between them is undeniable, but George doesn't kick the door open. He doesn't scream. He watches his wife experience joy with another man, a joy she completely denies him, and he simply puts his truck in reverse and drives away into the dark. He absorbs the betrayal entirely alone, protecting Mary from the consequences of her own hypocrisy. A family dynamic built on one person's silent suffering will inevitably fracture the moment that person finally asks for a glass of water. For years, George functioned as the shock absorber for the Cooper family's chaos, but a shock absorber can only take so many hits before the metal snaps. That snap occurs in the explosive climax of season 4. The house is in turmoil, the kids are fighting, Mary is barking orders, and the suffocating pressure of being everything to everyone finally breaks George. In the middle of the kitchen, he drops the stoicism and looks his wife in the eye. He tells her, point blank, that he is deeply unhappy. He asks if she even cares. The tragedy of this scene lies entirely in Mary's reaction. She does not meet his vulnerability with empathy. She meets it with defensive outrage. She immediately redirects the conversation to her own stress, effectively telling George that there is no room in their marriage for his pain. When the invisible man finally raises his hand and says, "I am bleeding," the family realizes they don't know how to bandage him, because his role is to never bleed in the first place. George's confession doesn't heal the family, it breaks them, sending the children running from the house because the foundational lie of their safety, Dad's unbreakable contentment, has been shattered. To truly understand why George Cooper allowed himself to fade into the wallpaper of his own life, we have to look at the psychological concept of role strain, compounded by the toxic expectations of 1980s and 90s patriarchal stoicism. Role strain occurs when an individual struggles to meet the conflicting demands of a single role. George is expected to be the authoritative head of the house, the primary breadwinner, the gentle buffer for his neurodivergent son, the punching bag for his mother-in-law, and the emotional rock for his deeply anxious wife. He is entirely reduced to his utility. In psychological terms, George is experiencing a phenomenon akin to the glass child syndrome, but applied to a parent. A glass child is the healthy sibling of a child with severe needs. They are looked right through because the parent's bandwidth is entirely consumed by the child, requiring immediate triage. In the Cooper household, Sheldon's immense gravity-bending needs act as a black hole that swallows all available emotional resources. Mary, entirely consumed by managing Sheldon, has nothing left for her husband. George, recognizing this, internalizes the glass father mentality. He subconsciously concludes, if I have a problem, it will only make things worse. My love language must be my silence. This results in a devastating state of learned helplessness regarding his own ambitions. We see this vividly when George receives a life-changing opportunity to coach college football in Tulsa. It is the validation of his life's work. It is his ticket out of mediocrity. But the moment the offer is brought to the table, Mary torpedoes it. She frames it entirely around how the move would disrupt Sheldon. George's lifelong dream is killed in the living room, not with malicious intent, but with terrifying casual indifference. George doesn't fight back, because he has been conditioned to believe his dreams are the least important variables in the Cooper family equation. The psychological toll of this is a man who begins to grieve his own life while he is still living it. He drinks alone in his garage, not because he is an alcoholic stereotype, but because the garage is the only square footage on Earth where he doesn't have to pretend to be strong. Which brings us back to that painfully normal morning in season 7. George walking out the door, offering a brief goodbye, completely unaware that he will never walk back in. The most devastating irony of George Cooper's death is not just that it happened, it's when it happened. He dies of a massive heart attack just as he was finally stepping into the light. He had just secured his dream coaching job at Rice University. His marriage was finally finding a rhythm of mutual respect. For the first time in his adult life, George was on the precipice of being seen, recognized, and celebrated for exactly who he was.